Hi everyone, and welcome to Protecht's next webinar in its Enterprise Risk Management series, when we're talking about chaos to order, or from controls chaos to controls assurance. And our focus on controls management is really reflecting what is happening in, I guess, the wider enterprise risk management market, particularly in financial services, where we're seeing a huge focus on the need to improve controls and controls management. And this webinar is really about focusing on the next level. What do we need to do to move our controls that can be currently quite chaotic, all over the place, people don't really understand why we're doing them, to making them a really robust part of our risk management framework. As always, to join me as my partner in crime is my colleague Michael. I'll let Michael introduce himself. I'll quickly introduce myself and then we'll get stuck into the webinar. Michael.
Thanks, David. So I am the research and content lead at Protecht, and that involves looking after a lot of our thought leadership content, such as our blogs, ebooks, and these webinars, as well as looking after our training, particularly our Protecht Academy digital training, and have history in controls and assurance, had roles in that, and yes, got some stories perhaps to tell on the way through today, David. Over to you.
Fantastic. And yeah, my name's David. I'm the Chief Research and Content Officer at the Protecht Group. I'm one of the co-founders. For those that don't know Protecht, I'm the protection part of Protecht. I'm very passionate about risk management, and my business partner, another David, he's passionate about technology in risk management, hence the tech in Protecht. As a firm, we do four things, no particular order, but the first one is Protecht Academy, which is all about people, capability, culture. I think one of the most important foundational parts of good risk management is getting the culture, capability, and knowledge of your people right. Secondly, we have Protecht Consulting, which is around frameworks, governance, development of methodologies, policies, and so on. The kind of glue that makes the whole enterprise risk management hangs together. Thirdly, we have the engine room, which is Protecht ERM, our risk management system, does all aspects of enterprise risk management. And lastly, we have our customer success team, which is all about implementation of the processes, knowledge into our clients so that it becomes embedded in their day-to-day. And that is enough about Protecht. So over to what we're going to cover on this session. Firstly, what are the objectives? Number one, to really get across the value of controls and controls management. It is one of the big impediments to good controls management is a lot of our staff not really realizing the value of controls, seeing them as annoying rather than valuable. Secondly, what exactly are controls and what are not controls? We sometimes see risk registers full of thousands of controls, and you can't simply manage that quantity. When you look deeper, a lot of them are not controls. We'll talk more about that later. How controls management and controls assurance should be practiced, and in fact, what do they even mean? Who is responsible for managing and assuring controls? Roles, responsibilities, accountabilities. When controls management and assurance should be practiced? Is it once a year, once a day? What should it look like? And lastly, controls reporting. How do we report and become accountable to those that need to know about the performance of our controls? Now, housekeeping, duration will be around about 60 minutes. As we go through the webinar, please add your questions into the question box. And with those questions, we'll be answering them after the webinar's finished by way of a blog, and that blog will then be shared with all of you as part of the feedback. There will also be a post-webinar questionnaire. We do really value your feedback, as it enables us to improve our future webinars. Please take a minute at the end just to complete that before you leave. And finally, yes, the slides and the recording of this webinar will be made available, be sent to you, so that you'll be able to watch bits that you may not, or you may need to go over again, and maybe even share with your friends and family, maybe not your family. Okay, so let's get stuck into what controls are all about. And I guess at Protecht, and for me and Michael, one of the bugbears of dealing with customers and clients regarding controls is the general perception that controls are a straitjacket. They are a restrictor. They somehow reduce our ability to operate. They're a showstopper. And I guess even the word control, how many humans like to be told, I'm going to control you? We kind of recoil and go, no, you're not. I don't want to be controlled. So it's got the negative connotation. As a result, it's sometimes difficult to engage our wider group of employees and staff in engaging with controls and making sure they're operating really well. But I just want to throw something at you to redefine the way we really should be thinking about controls. Now, I happen to like Grand Prix Formula One in a big way. Anything petrol, anything noisy, I'm into. And I always think about a Formula One car, one of its key controls. It would be its brakes. Now, they have carbon fiber composite brakes that, with research and obviously development, cost millions and millions of dollars. Now, brakes are a control. The question is, what is the number one objective of why those cars have very expensive brakes? Sure, we could go down the pathway of saying, well, protect the driver, protect the car, protect the people around the track, stop the car quickly in case of an emergency. And all of those are valid objectives, but I would put to you they are not the key objective. The key objective, which I'll explain later, is in fact to enable the car to go faster, because the objective of that car is to win the race. Critical success factors: the fastest car around the track, which means the last one to break into a bend, the first one to accelerate out. Those carbon fiber composite brakes are there to be able to stop the car in a very, very short distance, so it can leave its braking distance or its braking point into a bend as late as possible. These brakes, therefore, number one objective is to enable the car to go faster, to enable the car and the race team to achieve its objective of winning. We'll cover that more later, but it completely redefines the way that people need to think about controls. Now, in terms of the agenda of what we're covering, we're going to look at the why, the what, the how, the when, and the who of controls and controls management. We're then going to finish up with controls reporting, the accountability piece. So first of all, let's take a look at the why. And asking the question why, what is the value of controls and what is the value of therefore controls management? And as we mentioned, this is often the elephant in the room when you first talk to an organization thinking about the perception of controls. And over many years, I've done this. I've often asked people who own a control is, why do you do that control? Which is the same as saying, what's its objective? Why do you do it? And the survey says, most common answers, what control? They have no idea what they're even doing as a control, which is not a great start for good controls management. Secondly, I've always done it, so I better do it again. I was told to do it by my superior. It's in my procedures manual. I do it mainly so I don't get in trouble. And also, a regulator says I have to. Now, all of these are woefully bad answers because not one of them actually reflects the true value of a control. Now, what we really should be getting to is when a person answers, why do you do that control? Is they're going to recite the control objective, which we're going to cover later. But ultimately, I'd love them all to say, to allow our organization to go higher, faster, quicker, be more successful sustainably. Now that turns our control objectives into value-adding, outcome-focused objectives, and that will grab the hearts, minds, and souls of our people. Now, in addition to these specific examples of how people think about controls, I want to have a look at how well organizations are managing their controls. And for this, I'm going to reference a table that was in a report from our banking regulator in Australia called APRA on one of our major banks in April of 2018. And in that review, they published this particular table. Now, this table along the top shows the main risk areas: conduct, security, data, disclosure, and so on. And then the next line, as it says there, it's the percentage of key controls for inherently very high and high risks that have been rated by the organization as marginal or unsatisfactory, or to really be honest, controls that were less than effective. Now, how many have we got here? Look at security. 1 in 5 key controls on those high and very high risks were not working effectively. If we look at Conduct, we're looking at 1 in 10. Errors, 1 in 10. Now, some of you might sit there and go, that's pretty good. I'm not sure it is. Firstly, they are key controls. We'll talk more about key controls later, but a key control is non-negotiable, which means you should never operate the activity, the organization, without the controls being working. As a result, what should that percentage be in a really well-controlled environment? Yes, it should be zero, as in 100% of our key controls are working effectively. I want you to imagine getting on an aircraft, flying on a long-haul flight. As you go into the aircraft, you look left into the cockpit. 2 pilots sitting there, lots of red lights flashing on the cockpit. You say, what are you doing? And they say, we're having a coffee waiting for you to board. We're just about to take off. And you go, what about all those red flashing lights? Aren't they indicating that some key controls aren't working? What would you think if the pilot said to you, oh, mate, 20% aren't working, but the other 80% are fine. Hop in, we're taking off. I don't know about you, but I'm not getting on that plane. I'm running straight down the stairs again, and I'm running off. I wouldn't want to take off in an aircraft with 1 light on. Right, certainly not a light on a key control, and maybe even a non-key or compensating control. I would want them to be working as well. And you know, in the airline industry, they will not take off if there is any hint of an error. That's the standard we need to get within our organizations, especially for risks that impact the customer, such as financial services, conduct risk, and so on. It should be 0 or not working effectively. Now, in terms of that, Michael, I know that you've given me some stories about controls that maybe should have been working and weren't. Over to you.
Yeah, I think my favourite story in this regard is where they did actually do some testing. It was a casino that had a generator. They replaced the diesel in the generator every week. They thought they were doing an exceptional job in keeping everything up and running. And they tested it, made sure that the generator actually fired up on a weekly basis because it's such an important control around power outage. Then they had a power outage and the generator fired up, but the power didn't go to their building or didn't go to their part of the building, it went somewhere else. So it's important to know when you are doing your testing and your assurance that you are assuring the right thing. I think that's an incredible story.
Absolutely. And, you know, we're talking about one of the main drivers of needing to up controls management is they're not well respected controls, not well understood. But also we've got, I guess, another main reason why we need to be doing this, Michael.
We are seeing a much bigger regulatory focus around controls and controls management. And think about why the regulators are there. Let's take that step back first. And we look at regulations as being the risk appetite of society. The regulator's there to protect consumers, protect sector stability, and that could be financial services, could be the energy sector, health sector, really any sector where they're looking for that kind of stability. And particularly we're seeing a lot more focus on critical infrastructure in many regions. Now, there's 2 ways that regulators can look at that. One is the outcome focus. What is it that you need to do to prevent undesirable outcomes? What's the outcome that the regulator is looking for? And then do you have the right controls in place? Do you have the right assurance to be able to demonstrate that to the regulator that we have all the right controls in place to manage to that outcome? But there is also perhaps a more direct compliance focus where there may be a requirement for specific controls. The regulator wants you to put in this specific control or a type of control and ensure that you have that in your organization. They're also seeing, in some cases, a focus on frameworks where a regulator wants you to be aligned to a specific framework. Now, we see this most commonly around cybersecurity. So some examples here are the NIST framework, the cybersecurity privacy frameworks, but we do see some other frameworks as well around safety, and some sectors will have very specific frameworks. So we're seeing there's a need to align and have your controls both aligned with the frameworks themselves, but then having that assurance that you are meeting the requirements of those particular frameworks. We're seeing that much more commonly, as I said, in cybersecurity, but also in some other sectors as well.
And I guess there might be some people listening in going, controls, 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 controls. I can't even move. And I love your next story, mate.
Yeah, so I think controls assurance also helps with over control because it's very easy to continue to add another control, knee-jerk reaction, add another control. And I can tell a personal story here where in doing some assurance work, that led to a lightening of controls. So an exception process was in place, someone had to monitor it on a regular basis, and I was doing the assurance work. We found out that someone had not been monitoring this exception report, which was a discount report or essentially revenue management. And they hadn't been monitoring this report for many, many months. And their initial response was, oh, I'm sorry that I haven't done that. I'm going to start doing that again now. And we took a step back and said, well, why does it exist? Why is it here? And when we looked at the potential downside and massive amounts of discount under this particular process, even the really extremes were still insignificant to the organization. And it turned out, 5 years prior, there'd been one of the big four had come in to say, hey, you don't have a process here. And someone said, well, okay, yep, we'll put that process in place. Knee-jerk reaction, had very minimal value to the organization, and no wonder they weren't following that control. But rather than say this is something you have to do, the assurance led to actually we're looking at the value here. Let's remove that from the process and we simplified it to a once a year. Let's just look at the marginal change, and if it's more than a certain threshold, then do your deep dive. So we really lighten the load on that particular control and that risk.
And I think the thing that's really important here is we're looking for a control framework that is effective, but also efficient. Okay, so in terms of our focus on controls management, what does controls management entail? We think there's really 4 elements to controls management, and in this webinar we're going to focus on 2 of those. Firstly, to design and implement effective controls. Now that may be on a new process, it may be on an existing process that hasn't got adequate controls. To identify what's the best control, design it really well to meet the objective and make sure it's implemented. Secondly, then is continuous improvement of controls. So we never should sit on our laurels and go, we have the optimal control framework, because with the development of new ideas, technology, risks may change. We should always be considering, do we still have that efficient and effective control? And Michael's previous example is an example of continuous improvement, where we've improved the control framework by removing a control that wasn't really required because of materiality. Once we've got that, we then move on to understand how well the controls are working, which is number 1, control assurance, and more widely, controls assessment. We'll explain those more later, but this is the 2 that we're going to focus on in this session, is control assurance and controls assessment. Now, the other element of controls management is to understand exactly why we have controls. And I'll take you back to the Grand Prix example, but I want to go now back and refer to the ISO 31000 standard and think of logically what controls are. A control is a key tool for managing risk. Now we think about what risk is. Risk is the effect of uncertainty, which means risk management must be managing the effect of uncertainty. So controls are a key tool for managing the effect of uncertainty on objectives. What's the end aim of all of this? It's the last word in that second sentence, objectives. So the whole purpose of controls is outcome management. It's objectives management. It is there to ensure we achieve better outcomes sustainably. I often tell the story of I used to do a lot of hang gliding many years back, and my key control was my parachute. Before I flew, what would I always think about when I was looking at my parachute? People often think, oh, I don't have to use it, I hope it's packed all right. I used to think, no, once I get this parachute on, now I can have some fun, because that would enable me to go up to 12,000 feet, do certain maneuvers, because I knew that if the glider broke or something happened, I had my safety net. So the number 1 thing is I had a ticket to fly once I had that parachute on. That was my number 1 thought, and that's the same as the brakes on a Formula 1 car. So always think, what is the outcome that's going to be improved by the controls that you are putting in? So we're now going to then address the what. What exactly are controls? Let's understand them a little bit better. Now, ISO 31000 says that a control is a measure that maintains and or modifies risk. That is a technically correct definition, but I've used it on non-risk people quite a lot, and they just glaze over, not understanding what on earth we're talking about. So at Protecht, we typically talk about this, and that is that what characteristics in risk are we trying to modify to change its level? We typically address likelihood of the risk occurring and the impact consequence if that risk were to occur. And the control is therefore aimed at mitigating a threat risk, so reducing either likelihood and or impact. Therefore, we prefer a definition along these lines: a specific action taken with the objective of reducing either the likelihood of the risk occurring and or the impact if the risk were to occur. Now let's consider now how risk is made up. What are the components of risk so we can better understand it? Because once we've done that, we can overlay controls to get a really good understanding of how a specific control modifies that risk. Now, risk is made up of several components. The first component is the root cause of the risk, where it all starts. Once that root cause occurs, it generally dominoes through various events to what we refer to as the main event, or the top event for that risk. Now, the top event is what we typically call at Protecht the oh no moment. And that's when you're traveling through your day, everything's wonderful, something happens such as start to lose balance and you go, oh no, that is the main event that we're referring to. It's the point you lose control of the situation. Now, once that happens, it then generally impacts upon a critical process or a process that you are running in your organization, which is aimed at achieving your objectives. As a result, the event somehow impacts negatively on the process, which means your objectives are then impacted negatively. We then have four main components making up inherent risk before considering controls. So to get to residual risk after controls, we simply have to add controls. Those are the five components of risk. Now, we typically are risk event centric, which means for each risk we only have one main event, and that should be the short name of the risk in the risk register, such as cyber intrusion, falling from height, and so on. As a result of one main event, there could be multiple causes that lead to that event. There could be multiple processes impacted by that event, and there could be multiple impacts or objectives impacted by that event. And sure enough, multiple controls over that complete risk. For those of you that are familiar with it, you put an outline around that diagram, and yes, we have risk bow tie analysis. If you wish to know more, have a look at our knowledge center or give us a call and we'll point you in the right direction if you want to know more about risk bow tie analysis. This then makes up the five components of risk. However, we always consider managing risk and compliance together. GRC, risk compliance. Now, how do we link now compliance obligations in? Well, one of our objectives in an organization should always be to comply with regulatory obligations. So one of those impacts is non-compliance. As soon as we have that impact of non-compliance on the right, we can link that to which particular obligations you have not complied with, and that's where compliance obligations link. As a result, we've now got a linkage of controls to the various aspects of the risk and indirectly to the compliance obligation. However, Michael was talking earlier about regulatory compliance obligations, where some of them directly require you to have specific controls in place. Right? As a result, you can also directly link then your compliance obligation to a specific control that is required. Driving a motor vehicle, you are required to wear a seatbelt, in most countries anyway. Now, the seatbelt is there obviously to address the risk of an accident, but also it's directly linked to the obligation of requiring a seatbelt so that you do not get fined. Now here we have the building blocks, and it's only now that we understand the risk and the obligations that the controls link to can we start getting a better understanding of how controls work, and we need that for controls management. Let's move to a worked example, and the worked example is the one I mentioned earlier, cyber intrusion as the oh no moment. Now, on the left-hand side, working back to root causes, here's some examples. I'm sure you can come up with your own story, and this is a very high-level risk. I'm not going to grab too much detail, but this shows now our root causes together with our interim events that then link it to the main event. That is called the left-hand side of the bow tie, the driver's side. We now expand that out to how does it link with our objectives, and we go to the right-hand side, and this now shows how the cyber intrusion now links to our key objectives, financial objectives, compliance objectives, and so on. This is the inherent risk. We now add a range of typical controls on for our cyber intrusion risk, and we have now the picture of our residual risk. This is what is required for good controls management, because you've now got the full picture together with the relationship between the controls and the risk. Now, what types of control do we have? Now, depending on your organization, some organizations recognize only 2 types of control, some 3, some 4. We like 3 at Protecht, but we obviously reflect what the client wants to do. So let's highlight what these 3 main controls are. Number 1, controls that are aimed at the beginning of the life of a risk up towards root cause. These are called preventive controls, and they are there to prevent the oh no moment from occurring. Therefore, they are aimed at reducing the likelihood of the main event occurring. We then have a second set of controls called detective controls. And detective controls rely on the analysis of information. Based on that information, they scale it and then work out whether there's a problem. And then from there, we then go and act. So we detect and act. Good example of preventive controls is physical security controls, segregation of duties, and so on. Detective controls, reconciliations, monitoring, reviews. This all involves analysis of data. Now here, we at Protecht recognize early detective and late detective controls. Early detective are before the main event, late detective are after the main event. And finally, we have on the right-hand side what we typically call corrective controls or reactive controls, and these are aimed at reducing the impact of the risk once it has occurred. Now, as you can appreciate, the life cycle of risk starts at the left and moves to the right. Therefore, your preventative and controls early detective are much more proactive in managing risk rather than your late detective and your corrective. We'll address that in a second as to how each control modifies the risk. Now, some people like to use directive controls. Protecht doesn't, but we would if you want to, of course. And directive controls are controls that direct people to do things in a certain way. Now, if you identify such things as policies as controls, by the way, me and Michael don't like doing that. We'll talk about that in a second, right? But if you did, it would have to go in the category of directive controls because they are directing people to behave in a certain way, right? Up to you, but there is the 4 that you could be using. So what effect of the controls have on risk? I'm only going to refer to the 3 types of control because that's the only ones I can highlight exactly how they impact on risk. Now, the way this works is when we assess the level of risk, we assess the likelihood of the main event occurring and the impact on our objectives if the main event were to occur, which means the left-hand side of the bow tie, its earliest life of the risk, that's all about likelihood because up to that main event, the main event has not yet happened. Once it has happened, the likelihood is 100%. So it's all now about impact. What does this mean? It means a control that attaches to the left-hand side of a bow tie are likelihood reducers and the right-hand side are impact reducers. That means that as a general rule, preventive controls reduce likelihood, early detective reduce likelihood, late detective reduce impact, and corrective, reactive reduce impact. Now, this tells us a very important story because most of us know the saying prevention is better than cure. So for the majority of risks that we face that have a reasonable level of probability or likelihood of occurrence, right, it's much better to maximize your preventive controls and early detective because it's better to prevent than cure. So we should always focus on managing risk at the beginning of its life with preventative and early detective controls rather than waiting it for to happen and using late detective and corrective. The only exception here is when you face a very low likelihood, big impact event, such as a major weather event, right, something like that, or geological event, then there's not a lot you can do really about likelihood. It's all about making sure that you have corrective controls in place, such as good DRP, BCP, insurance, and so on. Now, we've really highlighted the detailed understanding of what controls are. In an enterprise risk management framework, we need to be able to categorize and classify these controls so that we're able to link our information to those controls and then aggregate the information up to executive and board level. And this brings us to control libraries. Michael.
Thanks, David. Yes, I think anyone who has or knows Protecht knows that we love a good taxonomy as much as we love bow ties. So this is an example of a taxonomy for controls. And we find this is probably one of the later libraries or taxonomies that people build. They might build risk libraries and taxonomies, but often controls can be a bit neglected. So you may have multiple levels for your taxonomy, and this helps with some of the ways in which you can potentially aggregate some of those controls and for reporting. So if we think about some of the benefits, like why would you want to put taxonomies in place? We'll just go next. Thank you, David. Benchmarking comparison. So particularly for larger organizations where you may have a control as part of your library that fits in some of these taxonomies, you may be able to look across the organization where the same control is being performed in different parts of the organization and start benchmarking. How well are they doing with that particular type of control? And then being able to say, let's go and learn from them. How do we compare? And similarly for reporting, it allows you to then aggregate up what types of controls do we have. You may have hundreds, some organizations even have thousands of controls. And you may need to report that to higher levels of the organization, and you can't report individual controls, individual control effectiveness, individual control testing. You'll need to look at how you can aggregate that up. Are there specific types of controls that maybe we're not performing quite so well in, or maybe even where we have gaps? Which does relate to this next point. There's a bit of validation. If you've got a library, one thing we don't like taxonomies being used for is a simple checklist, but it can be a way to validate whether you have any gaps. And also consolidation. You may have the same control independently being performed across the organization, but you might not have people realizing that's the case. And you may be able to take a look and go, actually, we've got this same control in this category being performed 10 times across the organization. Should that only be one control that's then applied across the organization? And we'll talk a bit later about shared control management.
Right, thank you, Michael. Now, what we're going to move on to now is controls management. As we spoke about earlier, that really involves 4 components. For this webinar, we're going to focus on control assurance and controls assessment. And that is the area that in most organizations needs improvement. And this is an area that the regulators in a lot of jurisdictions are focusing on that needs improvement, hence our focus. Now, in terms of these, what do they really mean? Okay, so control assurance is aimed at providing assurance as to the ongoing effectiveness of your controls. Now, typically, we're using the singular term here, which is control assurance. Does that specific control work effectively or not? So it's control centric. However, that's not the end game in controls. The end game is, are our key risks or are our risks being adequately managed by the group of controls over them? That moves us then to the next level up of multiple controls, controls assessment. And it's typically part of the RCSA, risk controls self-assessment process. So you need to have a link now between your control assurance testing and your controls assessment. So this is now assessing the degree to which the controls modify the likelihood and consequence of the risk as a group of controls. So this is now multiple controls. We're going to have a look at the control assurance primarily and just touch upon briefly the controls assessment. So how does this look utilizing the bow tie that we have just been discussing? Well, control assurance is about that individual control. How well is it working? Now, some people do that, and then they report, "Oh, my control is effective," and everybody, is happy, and we go, "Everything's wonderful." The problem is, it's kind of irrelevant if one player in the team is playing really well and the other 4 are pretty hopeless, or the other 3 are pretty hopeless. The whole team is going to fail. So you need to now start grouping them together, and we now take them as a group and go, how well are they acting as a group? Now, obviously, we do this by addressing it in our risk control self-assessment when we are moving from our inherent risk before controls to our residual risk after controls. How do we believe they are working as a team? But let's go back to control assurance and consider, how do we assess the effectiveness of a control? Now, standard methodology, common methodology, certainly the one that we follow at Protecht, looks at 3 main areas to understand the effectiveness of a control. Number 1 is the objective of the control. That is critical to identify because that's what defines whether or not we are effective. If we define the objective and then we test the control and it's meeting the objective 100%, we would say it's fully effective. Maybe if it's meeting at 10%, we'd say it's ineffective, and if it was 50%, maybe if we use it, it'd be partially effective. Now, a lot of organizations do not identify control objectives very well, so I'll take you through a worked example in a second. Once we've got our objective, we move to design effectiveness. How well is the control designed to enable it to meet the control objective? This is not how it's actually operating, it's just simply the design features. Does it enable it to meet the control objective? Within the constraints of the design effectiveness, we then move on to how well is it actually operating, to the degree to which the control is being operated and applied is as intended. Now let's have a look at those. The first one then is the objectives of the control. Now there's lots of methodologies around this. Some people use drop-down boxes with standard objectives such as completeness, accuracy, validity, restricted access. I've seen that a lot. Now the problem is with that is that our users tend to go, oh, I need an objective attached to this control. They do the drop-down box, they click on the one they think is the most appropriate, but they haven't really thought about it. And it really does restrict the thinking using preset objectives. What we at Protecht suggest is that you come up with a methodology that really does cut to the chase of what the control actually does. Now we've come up with a three-part approach to this, and I'll give you a worked example based on system access controls that we had in the cyber intrusion example. And it goes like this. We suggest, and it's Protecht's methodology, so you can take or leave it, it's up to you, we won't be offended. You first of all use the control type, right, as far as you possibly can, and turn the control type into a verb. So if it is a preventive control, the objective starts with to prevent. A detective control, to detect. A reactive control, corrective control, to react or correct. Now, nice and simple, it is turn it into a verb. Number two, we reference the risk. The risk of, or it could be risks if the control relates to multiple risks. And then finally, define what it's expected to do to the risk with respect to its components of likelihood and impact, or likelihood and consequence. Worked example, system access controls is preventative, therefore to prevent the risk of unauthorized access to systems and data. So as to, now we know it's on the left-hand side of the bow tie, so it is a likelihood reducer, so as to reduce the likelihood of the risk unauthorized access occurring. I'll say that quickly, to prevent the risk of unauthorized access to systems and data, so as to reduce the likelihood of that risk occurring. That is a nice, neat way of doing a control objective, and it can be done to every single control you can possibly think of. Now, once we've identified that objective, we then move on to design effectiveness. Now, there are many, many features of a control that you can look at for design, probably about 50 or 60 at the last time I did a detailed list. That was an exciting day. But what we can do is we can categorize those features into categories. The most common categories we see are these on the left: the why, the what, the who, the when, the how, and the value of the control. So number one, why? Does everybody know what the control objective is? Has it been stated? Number two, what does the evidence of the control look like? Number three, who is responsible for control? Who's the operator? Who is the owner? And so on. Therefore, you would then take those and you would then set out what are the features you're looking for this control, and you would test the design against that. The second one is, once we've done the design, we then move to operating. Operating, no surprises, is the same 5, but value doesn't generally come in here because it's dealt with only in design. But we then ask, well, does the people that do this control actually know what the objective is? We've set it out, but are they understanding it? Right? Is the control actually evidenced as it was supposed to be evidenced? Is the right owner and operator actually the person who is owning it, or did it get fobbed off to someone else, and so on? Now, these two then enable us to test the design and operating effectiveness, and then we bring them together into an overarching assessment of the control. Now, this is a little bit of a fancy way to say that you look at the design effectiveness and the operating effectiveness, and whichever one has the lowest score is the overall score for the control. But we prefer a little matrix down the bottom there that joins them together, but that's basically the answer that you get. And that is a quick snapshot of what we see as really good controls assurance testing. And obviously those design and operating tests are backed up by test plans, scripted test plans, undertaken by the appropriate people at the right frequency, and so on. Now, for some of you, you might be going, I don't do that, we don't do that. We don't do anything like that. So there is absolutely a maturity journey that you need to go on with controls. Michael, insight into maturity.
Thanks, David. And I think this is where we can bring out some of the war stories, battle scars perhaps, of things that we've seen. So this is just a high-level view of or a snapshot of some of our maturity roadmap when it comes to controls and some of the key components. So we think about the strategy and framework. Some people just don't have a strategy, as David just alluded to, and they may not even have a definition for what is and what is not a control. You know, one of my war stories, I guess, is looking at a control register or a risk register that had a list of controls, and one of those was reputation. Their reputation was their control. That was going to prevent the risk or mitigate some of the risk. And linked to some of the other categories is, well, how do you test that? How do you build a test program for testing how effective your reputation is? Process, there may be no measures of control effectiveness, as David just mentioned, moving all the way up to having dynamic control testing. So rather than just a scheduled frequency, it might be dynamic based on management information that you receive. Having systems, typically everyone does start with Excel, Word. It might just be the word of a control or the name of a control in a Excel spreadsheet, building up to full integration with the rest of your system, including your assurance being integrated into the rest of your operational risk profile. Monitoring and review, there's no point doing that testing if you're not escalating, not actually driving any action in the organisation. And as David said earlier, providing that assurance to key stakeholders to make decisions. And finally, the culture, linking back to what David said about people, you have people just say, well, what even is a control? I didn't know that was a control, leading up to full embedded control management across all roles, including the board, full governance, which David will cover a little bit later, to all the people on the front line knowing what their control is, knowing what objectives are, and having that be fully embedded in just the way that they do business, not just do risk management activities, but in the way they just operate the business to achieve operational outcomes. So in terms of the types of tests that then support, I guess, that higher end of the maturity journey, these are some of the types of tests that are quite common, but they tend to move from things at a very high level of effort, and usually also have a high level of comfort, down to low level of effort, but maybe a low level of comfort. So I won't go through all these in detail, but some of those will apply to different, some will apply to design effectiveness, some apply to operating effectiveness. We are seeing a bit more of a shift now to try and automate some control testing, which, depending on the types of tests, can have a variable level of comfort. It's best suited where you've got some very clear definition for the data that you need to rely on in order to have some assurance over that test. So even where you do have automated testing, that might still need to be augmented with more traditional testing methods. Now, we're also seeing a bit more of a drive to link controls and their implementation in an organisation to frameworks. And we see this most commonly in cyber. And one of the problems that some particularly CISOs might face is, I've got this control, but does it also potentially apply to a different framework? So they might be applying ISO 27000 framework, they might be applying controls across a NIST framework. And the question that's starting to come up more and more is, well, I've got particularly third parties, you know, my vendors, people I work with, they're asking me to be aligned with a different framework. How well aligned am I? So being able to link your controls to both your internal taxonomy, but also linking to some of these other requirements, then starts allowing you to do testing once that can then link to more of those standards. And again, also allowing that real time. So being able to do that test, and if you've got that linkages, this is a bit higher in that systems piece of the journey, you can then have a report that dictates to you, yes, we are aligned with some of these other standards, or here are the gaps where we might need to do some different testing. And additionally, maybe add up for identify these other frameworks that, you know, we've done all this testing, we've done it in alignment with one of the frameworks. Now that we've linked these requirements, how well, what are our gaps? Where do we need more controls to be put into place, or more testing and assurance to then meet some of these other requirements? And finally, on the reporting side, you may have linkages between a controls framework, because that is what a cyber security expert needs to know. They need to know that they're aligned with a particular framework. But then you might have an enterprise risk management person who needs to know more about just the broader control taxonomy that you're looking at. So having all these linkages, linking your controls to your frameworks, whether it's an internal taxonomy, whether it's some of these requirements from a framework, it allows reporting for different stakeholders to give them the assurance and the decision-making assistance that they need.
And I know one of the big questions we always get is effort required, and that links strongly with, how frequently should we be doing this work? Because a lot of people, it's not being done and they go, oh my goodness, how much have we got to do and when? So maybe a few comments over a controls management cadence, Michael.
Yeah, sure. And I think this comes back to that starting point of maturity on this cadence is, do people just do this once? Is it just part of their annual review of their risks? Do they then just look at the controls and do a finger in the air assessment as to whether they're effective? Or is it a more in-depth testing program? So there's not a one right answer, because it should be ideally more dynamic, where it is informed by new information that you have. If you've got a key risk indicator or a key control indicator that seems to be escalating, maybe that's a trigger to be more dynamic and go and test that control outside of its normal cadence. You also need to start thinking about the resourcing around that controls testing. It's all well and good to say we've got this many controls and we're going to test each of them quarterly, annually, whatever the cadence is that you expect. But you need to think about how long each of those tests are taking. We are having some of our customers start thinking about this, and how do we match our resourcing to how long each control will take. And some of our customers are starting to look at actually capturing the number of hours each test is likely to take, so they can start forecasting what their resource and requirements are going to be. Now, these are some of the considerations you may want to put into place when considering your control testing frequency. Now, key controls, those are the ones that really should be tested more frequently. Some people may not even test some of their minor ones, or may only include them as part of their regular risk and control self-assessments. Do you have different frequencies for design and operating effectiveness? Do they have to have a different cadence? The difference between the inherent and the residual risk, so the effect that the control is actually having on the risk, that does relate somewhat to key controls, but those that have that really high impact, as David was saying before, prevention is better than cure, but where there is a really high impact, you may want to make sure that those key controls really are tested more frequently. You may have regulatory requirements, and you also need to consider, where does this align more from a timing perspective with your risk and control self-assessments? Do you need to make sure that testing is done perhaps just prior or close to some of those assessments? So then when you're looking at the collective, the whole risk assessment, that you've got some really good assurance and understand which controls are currently working or not, to then assess the level of risk that your organisation might face. Any comments from you, David?
Yeah, now we've done the why, the what, and the how, the when. There's one left, and that is the who. And that is really about roles and responsibilities for this work. And let's just say controls and controls testing is often a hot potato that is willingly thrown over the department wall to someone else, especially if they have the name risk in their title, assurance in their title, or audit in their title. How and where should this stick? So I want to initially refer to the most common governance model that we see being used globally, and that is supported by the Institute of Internal Auditors, the 3 lines model. To have a first look, and then we'll go a bit more in depth in terms of types of control and roles and responsibilities. So if we think about the 3 lines model, I want to just explain it simply with an example. Firstly, we know that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So I always use the analogy to think about, after this webinar, you're feeling a bit mentally, physically jaded, and therefore your objective is to make yourself feel better. Your activity is to go out for a walk. You open your door and look up, and there's a big black cloud above you. It looks like it might rain. That rain represents a root cause of a risk, and that risk is you getting wet and cold, and therefore that negatively impacts your objective of feeling better. Now, what could you do when you see that rain? You could run back inside. It's called avoidance. The problem is with avoidance, it's eliminated the objective as well. It's the sledgehammer. What we want to do is we want to achieve our objective while we manage that risk. So what we might do is put up one of these, the umbrella. Now, the umbrella is everything that we're talking about in this webinar. It is the internal control system, and how effective that is the degree to which it's managing those risks that impact upon your organization. Now, that umbrella is held by and owned by the front line of your business. They are the people, everybody that's doing their controls. Therefore, we call it line 1. If that is leaking, we have a problem. What do? We have a second line, which is known as risk management. And risk management, even though it says management of risk, it actually is there to review and challenge the owner of the umbrella to make sure that umbrella in the first line is working really effectively. They are not there to hold the umbrella on behalf of line 1, and they are not there to have a second umbrella to catch the drips. Lastly, if that word doesn't work, we've still got a leak. We now have internal audit, provide independent assurance that the 2 lines above are working effectively. And of course, if they fail, sorry guys and girls, we're going to get wet. And that is the 3 lines of defense. So what that highlights is that line 1 is the frontline business, and they own the risk and they own the controls. Line 2 is review and challenge, and line 3 is assurance. Therefore, where should controls management be happening? It should be managing and happening in line 1. The business own the controls and they are responsible for their performance. I would expect the majority of control testing assurance to be done in line 1. Probably unlike what you're doing at the moment, because we typically give it to audit or risk management. So what should be the true role of line 2? They should be reviewing and challenging the work that's being done in line 1 to ensure it's being done really, really well. And they may, as part of their review, conduct their own tests, but that should not be in substitution of what line 1 is doing. And assurance audit will do their own audit tests. But remember, that is not in substitution for what lines 1 and 2 are doing. It is there to ensure that line 2 and line 1 are working effectively. That is the purpose. But that in essence means that line 1, the business itself, is primarily responsible for controls management. Michael, there is another angle in terms of the type of control of roles responsibilities. Over to you.
We're seeing a big drive around how to manage shared controls. So this is a very simplified version of an organisation or business unit structure, where we'll make the assumption that the heads are owners potentially of some of these controls. Now, some of these controls will perhaps sit primarily in one area. So here the example is employee performance review. You may or may not consider that a control in your organisation, but the human resources department is likely, or people and culture, may be responsible for the design of that control, but individuals across those other departments need to actually apply that control. They need to operationalize it and make sure that it is working effectively. So the question is, does the person in human resources need to test the design, and is that a separate test with ownership for operation across those others? And we're finding that there needs to be different testing. We're building out some of that capability to make sure that different people who own different parts of a control and then run those tests and aggregate some of that reporting. Another example here for marketing is there might be a branding guidelines checklist that's primarily used by marketing, but might be shared across some parts of the organisation. So some controls may just be blanket, have to be used in all parts of the organisation. Others might be pick and choose depending on what they do. And finally, we'll have some very localised controls. So data backups will primarily be sitting in information services, but it might be applied multiple times in different contexts. So here we might have multiple data backups for different types of systems, different types of information or data that's required to be protected, perhaps with different levels of risk, and might also have different objectives, different ways that they're applied. And this is also another good example of where a control might not be owned by the people that own the risk. So primarily data backups might be managing disruption, but that might be primarily in the customer service department, where they actually own the risk of disruption because it impacts them and their objectives, but information services manage that on their behalf. Any comments from you on that one, Dave?
No, the only thought I was going to say is some people often say, oh, who owns the control? And I always take the view that it goes like this. Each of these business areas will have their own objectives. They own those objectives. Any risks that could impact those objectives, they own those risks. Sorry, they absolutely own those risks. So every one of them will effectively own technology risk, even though they're not IT. However, a lot of the technology controls will be responsible, or their performance will be responsible of be the responsibility of IT. Therefore, IT own the control, and they are accountable to each of the business units that control is working effectively in managing their own risks. So just got to get that matrix right of who owns and is responsible for. Okay, we're now finishing off with a brief look at controls reporting. In terms of controls reporting, why are we reporting? Provide assurance, everything's okay, gives confidence. Equally though, opposite, provides warnings when controls aren't working effectively, helps us better make make better risk-reward decisions, knowing the extent of our controls. My parachute isn't working effectively. My decision is I'm not going to fly that day. So it's good for decision making, increased transparency and accountability across the organisation for the control framework. And also, very importantly, it supports a strong controls culture. You get what you report on effectively, or you get what you measure. And with that said, we can have then detailed reports. I'm not going to look at these in detail. I'm just giving you examples. This one just gives a summary of our total controls and gives then more richer information about them, particularly around their design, operating, testing ratings. This one is another direct one, which is more about controls assurance results in a little bit more detail, linking them to different business units, different risk types and so on. And each of these then drills down into specific controls related information. However, one of the things we're looking for in enterprise risk management is to give an overall integrated dynamic risk profile of the organisation. What does that look like? It looks like taking the taxonomies that Michael was talking about, and he looked at control taxonomies. We also have risk taxonomies, cause taxonomies, and so on. And I'm going to give an illustration of where we aggregate information to our risk taxonomies. And what we're doing here is we're picking up our main risk management processes. Over on the right, we have our controls assurance, which is what we've been talking about today, but it also is done together with incident management, issues and actions management, risk assessments, key risk indicators, and so on. And as long as all of those processes and data within those processes link to our central risk taxonomies, we will then be able to aggregate. And we call this then risk in motion at Protecht. And this is where we're aggregating all the information to give an overall risk health score. Now, within each of these business units, there will be separate risks. So there's a drill down to give you the ability to show all the information linked to a specific risk, and then it's aggregated up to each business unit. And then this one shows the corporate office. Now, the idea of this is to take all information known about that risk to be able to then bring it together and be able to show this is the risk profile, taking it all into consideration. For today's session, it's been that component there. What are our controls health score? And here we can see we've got 5 out of 5, so we're dreaming, because I'm not sure that that's utopia. That's on the right-hand side of Michael's maturity assessment, and I'm sure most of us are striving towards that. Now, once we've got that, if we have problems within our controls, we can then drill down all our risks, and this then shows a drill down capability where we're now identifying our control testing results. And here you can see then in detail what the control was and how well the design operating effectiveness has occurred. And that is that section there. And that gives us the ability not only to report separately on controls, but also aggregate it together with our overall risk profile. So that brings us to the end of the session. So I will pass over to Michael just to conclude and finish up. We're almost smack on time, but just in conclusion, I guess my main takeaway from the controls work that I've been doing is to change the perception that your people have of controls. If you can't overcome the fact that people see them as a hindrance and a hurdle, you will never be able to implement good controls management. So turn it into controls are enablers, not a hindrance, as your starting point. Michael, your key conclusions, and then we'll get you to wind up the session.
I think mine's an extension of yours, which is about having those people understand their role in control management. Who owns the control, who operates the control, who needs to test parts of the control or the whole control, who needs to receive information about controls. I think it is about understanding what's those roles and responsibilities around controls. So if you'd like to find out more about controls management and some of our other content, you can go to our Knowledge Centre. We have a whole bunch of other stuff that you can have a look at, including a controls design and assurance ebook. And we've also got our Protecht Academy courses. We do have a specific course on controls design and assurance. And we've also just released our Risk Management Fundamentals for Everyone course, which is a short course for people who know nothing about risk. So we do include the basics on what risks and controls are, and it's a good way to help you launch some of that capability. So thank you for joining us. We'd like you to stick on the line just for another minute or so, just so you can complete the after call or after webinar survey. Your information that you provide us does really help us enhance some of our content and find out how we can help you. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael.